but it's a little outdated. So this is part of the process of educating our members and the public about that process, how it works, and we have some wonderful speakers. So I'm glad that you joined us, and Chris Bobbitt, who is our program Vice President, will be introducing the speakers and moving us through the evening. So very, very, very pleased to have you with us tonight.
Well, welcome everyone. It's my privilege to introduce our panel members to you for this evening. You should have a program, and if you don't, I will shortly, that has more detailed biographical information. But let me start with Dr. Stephen Nicholson on my far right. He is an associate professor in the School of Social Sciences, Humanities, and Arts at the University of California, Merced.
A little louder, please.
Me too. He has held faculty positions and is tenured associate professor at Georgia State University as well as University of the Pacific. His education, he earned his bachelor's in political science from the University of California, Los Angeles. His doctorate degree in political science from the University of California, Davis. Publications include Voting the Agenda, Candidates, Elections, and Ballot Propositions. And he has been published in the Journal of Politics, State Politics and Policy Quarterly, Political Behavior, and the American Journal of Political Science. And seated next to Dr. Nicholson is Dr. Jessica Traunstein, Associate Professor of Political Science as well at the University of Merced. She has been an Assistant Professor of Politics and Public Affairs at Princeton University. Her education was earned her bachelor's in the University of California, Berkeley, her master's in political science at the University of California, San Diego, and that is also the institution where she earned her PhD, also in political science. Her publications include The Political Monopolies in American Cities, The Rise and Fall of Bosses and Reformers, American Journal, published in the American Journal of Political Science, the Journal of Politics, and the American Politics Weekly. I'd like to welcome Dr. Nathan Monroe, and he is as well Associate Professor in the School of Social Sciences, Humanities, and Arts at UC Merced. And he has held faculty positions at the University of the Pacific as well as Michigan State University, and earned his bachelor's degree in political science and history at the University of California, Santa Barbara, master's in political science, University of California, San Diego, and that's also where he earned his PhD in political science. Publications include articles in the American Journal of Political Science, the Journal of Politics, and Political Research Quarterly. And seated on my immediate right is Dr. David Kolnick, who is an associate professor at the Department of Political Science and Public Administration, as well as the director of the Masters of Public Administration program at Cal State University, Stanislaus. Dr. Kolnick earned his bachelor's degree from the University of California, Irvine, master's and PhD from the University of Arizona. His degrees in political science inform a multidisciplinary research agenda that focuses on public policy and governance issues, with special emphasis on the environment, public participation and engagement, and the U.S.-Mexico border region. Dr. Kolnick takes a leadership role in campus sustainability efforts. He's the facilitator of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences Council for Sustainability Futures, and annually chairs the committees that brought environmental conferences and speakers, such as the annual Great Central Valley Beaming Pioneers Conference to the university. Welcome, each of you. And at this point, I would like to open the floor to questions from the audience and get our discussion moving. Who'd like to go first?
Would you like us to?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, please begin.
Oh, okay. So I'll begin. obviously, many thanks to the League of Women Voters for putting on this forum and for inviting us. I feel really privileged to be here and talk to you all. With respect to the question, I think a question that we need to ask is reform necessary of the initiative process? And to answer that question, I think we need to ask, what is broken? What part of it does not work? Or is it working fine? And one area where I would like to say that it isn't broken, but many people say that it is, has to do with the voters themselves. Oftentimes, people will point to voters and say they're too incompetent, they're unknowledgeable, they make unwise decisions. But you know, when you start unpacking those arguments, I don't think they hold water. One of the arguments in particular that people make is that the side that spends the most money can win the election. So if you have some groups that have a lot of money and some groups that have very little, all else equal, the argument is the side spending more money is going to win the election and possibly dupe voters into voting for something that's contrary to their interests. Also, as I've mentioned, the argument is that ballot measures are just much too complex for people to understand. And if you look at them, there's some kernel of truth to that, right? I mean, we're voting on legal bills, we're voting on bills, you know, legal documents, and there's legalese and a lot of details to them. And I can't oftentimes make heads or tails of some of them. So it sounds like I've just made a good argument for why voters can't do this. But political scientists have studied this in some detail, myself included, and what we've found is that voters aren't fools. They can figure this out. And they can do this in a couple different ways. The first is, if they don't figure it out at all, oftentimes they just abstain. And I've done that before in voting myself. I've hit a ballot measure or something I didn't even know that was going to be on the ballot. I look at it, I have no idea what it says, so I just skip it. So that's not, you know, the paragon of virtue with respect to democracy, but that's something that voters have available to them, is they can always abstain if they don't sufficiently understand it. And we do find that a lot of voters do roll off, meaning that, you know, they'll vote for things that they know about and not vote for those that they are unknowledgeable about. And that makes a lot of sense. Secondly, on straightforward ballot measures, people go with their gut. And a lot of ballot measures offer easy opportunities to vote on issues that are relatively straightforward. Issues like the death penalty, for example, that's going to be before voters this fall. That's something that you can read all the details about the specific proposition, but chances are people are going to go with their gut instinct on that with respect to whether or not they want to end it or not. Now, come November, when the measure passes, you can say, well, the voters were fools because they voted this way. But not necessarily. They voted that way because it was consistent with their interests. So just because you might disagree with the outcome of a ballot initiative doesn't necessarily mean that the voters were foolish, right? We tend to think that, right? How could they possibly vote that way? But the standard I'm using is if you vote in a way that's contrary to your own interests, and if voters are voting in a way that's consistent with their preferences, I'd say the process is working well. So a lot of ballot measures do offer opportunities for people to vote on straightforward issues, and they can just kind of reason from their gut. And then on those complicated issues, the ones where you can't make heads or tails of it, but you know it's important, oftentimes groups, political parties, and prominent individuals and public officials take stands on ballot measures. In other words, they can provide information shortcuts for some of us. Sometimes in my classes I talk about 529 college savings programs. There are 50 of them across the United States, and you don't necessarily have to use the state program that you live in. You can go to any state and use their 529 savings program. How do you make sense of that as a parent? Well, as a parent, I listened to a consumer advocate who had ranked them himself, and it was someone that I found to be a credible, trustworthy source. And I put all my money into the 529 that he put in his top 10. Now, did I study all 50 of the programs in great detail? I did not. Did I make a wise decision? I think probably a good enough decision on average. So what people do is they'll turn to political parties. You know, if they are strongly or staunchly a Democrat or a Republican, In California, each of the political parties take positions on the ballot measures. They can easily use that as a cue and vote in a way that's consistent with their values. Assuming you're a Republican for principled reasons regarding conservatism, or you're a liberal, you're a Democrat because you're a liberal, that's going to be a pretty informative cue most of the time. Of course, there are opportunities to get it wrong from time to time, but on average, that's going to be an effective way to go ahead of doing things. Go ahead and do things. And also, people have just studied the outcomes of ballot measures, and one of the things they've found is that the side that wins the most money doesn't always win, and in fact, oftentimes they lose. So one of the worries is that big corporations are using their money to pass ballot measures, and they're duping voters to vote for these things that they don't like. But what research suggests is that it's not the case at all. Interest groups or corporations that have lots of money and spend lots of money are defeated a lot. And one of the reasons they're defeated is people make use of these cues. If they know that the gasoline companies like Valero is coming in and they disagree with Valero and they're anti-big oil, that's a good heuristic or cue for them to use in making an informed decision. So, it probably doesn't meet with the high standards that we would want voters to use, right? We want everyone to be perfectly informed and to have read everything and reason through it themselves. But like I said, there's a lot of information shortcuts available to voters to make fully informed decisions that parallel those decisions by people who have taken the time to do that. And there's been political science studies that have shown exactly that. In other words, people that use these information shortcuts make the same types of decisions as people that do all their homework. So this is a really powerful way that voters can use to navigate the ballot box and make reasonably well-informed decisions. Where I think we should focus our reform efforts are on the laws themselves and how we make them. In the legislature, before a bill becomes a law, you can amend it, and you can deliberate, and you can discuss, and you can change it, right? In the initiative process, there's no way of doing that. Once it's set in stone, or once it's set in stone. It's in concrete, we can't change it. Someone, a month after it's been circulated and, say, even been certified by the Secretary of State, can't say, oh wait, you've got this mistake here, don't you think? And they could say, yes, we wrote this wrong, but guess what? We can't change it. It's set in stone. So there's no way of changing it on the front end. And then on the back end, if it's passed into law, you can't amend these things easily. In fact, you need voter approval. So legislators who maybe see all the problems associated with the ballot initiative can't do anything with it. So I think what happens is it's a very inflexible way of making public policy. And my thinking about it is voters are doing a good enough job. What we need to do is allow the legislature and citizens to have input early in the process so that they can shape these ballot measures to be the best laws possible. And then make it easier on the back end for there to be some sort of amending or changing or tweaking to get it just right. As it stands now, we don't really have that possibility. Thank you.
So it's hard to follow that because Steve is a true expert on direct democracy, and I only think about it as a dabbler. But I'll talk to my knowledge on this. So I'll start by saying, thinking about history, I think, can be helpful in this sense when we're thinking about whether or not we like direct democracy or not. So a long, long time ago, when direct democracy was first invented, the idea was promoted at the turn of the 20th century, the middle of the 19th century. The idea was to return authority to the people, because the formal power structures were being dominated by powerful and sometimes very corrupt political machines. And that was true in California. That was what was said about why we were passing direct democracy in California. It was an attempt to open the political system by weakening the grip of political parties and private interests and returning power to the people. At the time, many people felt that the laws that were being passed by the legislature and signed into law by the governor were not representative of the will of the people. And so the idea was to allow people to speak and allow the majority to make their views heard. As the name implies, by design, this means a decrease in the power of representative democracy, right, as opposed to direct democracy. And that's going to be the point that I'm going to talk about here. Direct democracy can really work to serve public opinion when elected officials are recalcitrant. But I think, my personal opinion, is that it's debatable whether or not these actions really serve voters' interests more than representative government does. I want to tell you about a little bit of research that suggests that direct democracy can undermine the voters' interests rather than promote it. So you all know about Prop 13. I don't have to tell anybody in this room the history of Prop 13 or how it's operated in our state. If you think about Prop 13 and what I'm about to talk about, you'll have a pretty good sense of what I mean. It exemplifies a pattern in initiative outcomes. In many different kinds of settings across states, across cities, voters like to limit expenditure options of their government. They like to roll back taxes and limit the amount of money that governments can raise and spend. We might think, as Steve just suggested, that this is a good thing if voters are voting with their gut. They don't like the taxes, they don't want to pay the taxes, so they vote for no more taxes, right? We might think that they have voted in their interest, that they have voted correctly, as a political scientist might say. But that might be just what the public thinks it wants and not what the public actually wants. It turns out this is a really, really difficult question to study. How do you know what the public really wants as opposed to what they just say they want? Well, it turns out that in the field that I work in, local politics, this can be a little bit easier to study because most everyone, or at least many people, maybe a majority, agree on what a good outcome looks like when we're talking about city services. I'll give you an example. How many of you in this room like sewage overflows? It turns out nobody does, except for Steve, right? So, same thing is true with response times from your fire department. Lower response time, better. My house did not burn down, good. My house burned down, bad, right? It's easy to tell on some dimensions of local politics what a good outcome is versus a bad outcome. So a colleague of mine at my former institution conducted a very careful study of this kind of process at the local level. What he did was he looked at what happens when voters place limitations on raising funds in fire districts. Now, the details of it are boring and not important, so I'll tell you the end result. What he argues is that a good outcome from your fire department is one where they put out fires fast. So what he looks at is what are the response times of fire departments when voters have tied the hands of government officials through a budget limitation versus when the officials can make the budget themselves. What he finds is a difference in response time by a full minute. Now you're thinking, a minute, who cares? A minute is huge in fire response times. The average a good fire response time is about 4.5 minutes. Adding a minute to that fire response time can absolutely mean the difference between your house burning to the ground and the fire department being able to save your house, and people living and people dying. So what happened in the study that Jeff conducted was that the voters had limited their fire departments, had limited the fire districts from raising money, and as a result, their response times increased across the board over many years. I want to tell you what the cost savings was for each individual household in these districts. 43 cents a year. 43 cents a year for a minute additional response time from the fire department. It's hard to imagine that if you had placed this information before the voters at the time, that anybody would have said, cut my taxes 43 cents so that my house could potentially burn down, right? It's implausible. Nobody would make that kind of trade-off. But that's not the way the issue gets debated. It's not the way the issue gets presented. The larger point is that taking the decision about when to increase budgets and how to allocate budgets out of the hands of representatives may not actually, in the end, represent outcomes that we want. In another chapter of my colleague's book, he studies the effect of direct democracy on sewage overflows, making the same sort of argument. But there, because the local officials have the ability to raise money in a different way, they can raise fees, they can raise revenue bonds, they don't have to submit to the voters for every budgetary increase, he found no difference. The conclusion here is that adding flexibility back into the process, I think, is key to making the process work better. Whether or not direct democracy hurts in the end has to do with what policy question you're asking and the flexibility that's afforded to the elected officials. In my personal view, the representative aspect of our democracy is a good thing. We did this on purpose when we built our nation. The delegation of authority for policy making allows us to take advantage of the expertise of our legislators and to ensure that majority views don't always, or even most of the time, trample on minority rights. This is not to say that direct democracy has never done any good. I wouldn't make that claim. But I think that the restrictions that it creates in our system are, in my view, on balance bad. And so I'll just end with what Steve said, which is adding some flexibility back into the system, both in the beginning of the process and after the process has concluded, would be the key reform that I would propose to the system.
I'll echo the thank you for inviting me and the woeful position that I'm in, having fallen out to much more informed speakers on the topic than myself. But I'm going to try to sort of pick up a theme a little bit, and so Jessica suggested that looking at history and looking at the particular policy context was vital to understanding whether or not reform was necessary and what sorts of reforms would be useful. And I'll suggest that another dimension on which we should consider whether or not reforms are necessary or useful, and that's the context within which the direct democracy process is being administered. So when I say context, I mean something that is both sort of temporal and sort of cross-sectional. That is, both looking at the place that the referenda, the particular state and the other institutions, the other sort of attitudes, the other norms that are in place in that state at that particular time, and also the way that that evolves over time. And so if we think about what California looked like at the time that the direct democracy was, that the initiative process was brought in, as Jessica mentioned, it's a time when there's where there's an extreme blockage in terms of the public's ability to see any kind of responsiveness in the legislature. And so at that time, the reform to create the initiative process is a very specific and sort of unequivocal response to a particular type of policy problem. If we fast forward 100 years and we think about what the institutional environment looks like in California, it's one that's much more complicated, both in terms of the way that the initiative process is used and the way that other institutions and the setup of California politics looks around the initiative process. So think about just the very basic problem that we're facing right now in California, right? I mean, there's lots of issues, there always are. But everybody's focused on our economic problems. And some of that is just a function of things that are going on outside of the control of California politics, right? In the world, in the United States, and the economy at large. But some of it is very specific to California and to California's government's decision-making process as it's sort of been created by a set of rules about how we go about making spending and revenue-generating decisions. So just think about the very simple. Up until a couple of years ago, both budgeting and taxation were done always by 2/3 votes, right? So just consider what that means for things that happen by initiative. If something is created, if a spending decision is made that restricts significantly the way the legislature can spend money, or that which is still true, that a taxing decision, or a decision about how revenue is either restricted, how we can raise revenue, or is requires a 2/3 vote, the level of institutionalization of that decision is very high, right? And so what that does is it creates a situation in which, regardless of holding constant how likely it is that voters are going to say make a mistake, the mistake is much harder to reverse in that situation, in that environment, right? And so, to make the sort of, to draw the connection on that first point, when we think about whether or not we need a reform in an initiative process, part of the answer to that question has to be, what is our recourse if that initiative process sort of runs afoul of our preferences? And that means at any given time, but also over time, right? If we make a decision in 1980 about how we want to restrict ourselves in terms of spending, or the kinds of revenue generating processes that we allow ourselves or disallow. If those preferences change dramatically in 25 years, that's institutionalized by this supermajority requirement in a way that could cause us to be unable to change something that we would otherwise, a huge majority of us would prefer to change. Think also then about the way that the initiative process begins to be used in an environment in which polarization is sort of increasing over the course of, say, the last 20 to 30 years. So where the initiative process is sort of, begins as a very sort of pure, or at least on the surface, a very pure policy-making mechanism, right? It's set out as an attempt to actually address needs in terms of lawmaking. It evolves over time to a point where over the last 20 or 30 years, we see the initiative process increasingly used as a strategic mechanism to affect other things on the ballot, right? So why is it that we had, why did Prop 8 and other propositions make their way onto the ballot a couple of years ago? The gay marriage proposition. Why did this become a nationwide sort of norm in terms of ballot initiatives? Is it because all of a sudden this issue came to a head and the right way to address it was through the initiative process? Maybe. Might also have been that people figured out the way that you mobilize certain types of voters is to put certain types of issues on the ballot, right? If you know what kinds of voters you need to come out, say as a candidate, right, for a statewide or nationwide office, and you know that you can get those voters out because they care a lot about particular issues, and that's just one example, but there are a number of different kinds of issues like this. The initiative process creates an avenue to be able to create, in a polarized electorate, mobilize people without having to do the work of mobilizing, right? Putting things on the ballot that they're going to show up. Third, and I'll sort of end with this one, although the list sort of could go on. In the other direction, think about what's happened in the last 20 years in terms of expertise in the legislature, right? So we now have a term-limited environment in which the longest-serving legislators in California have served somewhere on the order of 12 years, right? So this is a totally different environment than you get, say, in the U.S. Congress or in the pre-term limits era California legislature, where the amount of expertise holdover in the legislature from one year to the next was substantial. And so the ability, the trade-off between me or us as voters making policy decisions versus handing it, as Jessica said, to the delegated representatives who have a serious well of expertise. It's not that we as voters are now as expert as legislators because they're term limited, but that gap has closed, right? So in an era where, so an argument that suggests that we should in fact reform the initiative process because we're taking away lawmaking power from experts, in a term limited era that argument is less relevant, right? So I'm not you'll notice that my examples sort of run both directions. I'm not suggesting that we are in a situation in which all the evidence points in the direction of eliminating the initiative process or reforming it in a particular way. What I'm suggesting is that when we think about whether and how we should reform the initiative process, we also need to think about the other institutions, other rules, and other political strategies and norms that are in place at a particular time, to think about what the consequences and benefits are going to be of reforming that initiative process at any given time in any particular way.
Thank you so much, and also thank you to the league for inviting me. I'm a little bit worried because I think everything that I planned on saying was somehow said one way or another, and I feel like the bases are loaded, and I'm batting fourth, and so we'll see what we have to do, and I'm going to deviate a little bit, at least in order from what I said, to sort of play off of what the three colleagues already had to say. I'd like to begin by thinking about direct democracy. And certainly this is an idea that goes back in California about 100 years, but globally several thousand years. And it's ultimately about participation. And the initiative and referendum process offers us a real easy, straightforward way to get a lot of people involved in the electoral process or to participate. And as Dr. Moore pointed out, sometimes this is done for the wrong reasons, to manipulate constituencies to come out who might otherwise not vote. But another way to think about direct, and other times it's done for all the right reasons. It's done because of frustration over legislatures not listening to majorities and constituencies that matter. But another way to think about this is sort of on a breadth and a depth level. And in terms of breadth of participation, this initiative and referendum process offers us a great deal. It offers us this widespread. But it's oftentimes very shallow for all of the reasons that have been mentioned. Most people who are participating come out, they may or may not be our classic well-informed voter. They may use cues and shortcuts, and I think we all do that, and there's really nothing wrong with that. But they are not involved in drafting the proposal. They're not involved in deliberating with the proposal. They're not involved in implementing it. Think about after it's done. Legislation is just the beginning of the policy process. It needs to be put into effect. And I think in that sense, the direct, if we think about direct democracy deeper, we can recognize that there are limitations to the initiative and referendum process, and that's a start rather than a finish to direct democracy. In terms of some other things and some examples of this, there are some paradoxes with it. Dr. Traunstein and Dr. Moore both mentioned how the initiative and referendum process, particularly in California, came about due to frustration with our elected representatives and our representative institutions. And over the last 2 decades, 2.5 decades, that's become more pronounced. We have term limits. We have spending limits. We have all sorts of things where the voters have tied the legislature's hands. And then we get frustrated that the legislature doesn't do its job. So we have more direct democracy, more initiatives and referendums that further tie the representatives' hands, and it becomes a cycle where we get mad at the legislature. So let's have another proposition. We further constrain their ability to act, and guess what? We get mad at them because we don't like the outcomes. And that's a real paradox. And that leads to my fundamental interest in this, is what sort of policy outcomes does that produce? And all three of people before me have mentioned that there's a rigidity with this. It's an inability to adjust, inability to reform. And Proposition 13 was a fine measure in 1978 to problems that were prevalent in 1978. Skyrocketing home values, and what do you do with people on fixed income? How do you deal with that? We're not in 1978 anymore. We have different problems, but we're still living with Proposition 13. And even more recently, the voters recently enacted the high-speed rail through voter proposition. Seems we have a little buyer's remorse over that, because if you're reading the public opinion polls, one of the major reasons why Prop 30 is, why people are giving for hesitancy to vote for Prop 30, is they're uncomfortable with the way government's spending money, such as high-speed rail. Well, it's not the elected representatives who did this, it's us. And it's not that it's not that we're bad, ill-informed, it's not that there's too much complexity, it's that our values have changed. And the process doesn't leave us much room to adjust for that. And that's where I'll leave, so, policy design.